So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote for today. She is an Ojibwe language scholar from the University of Milwaukee. She is a poet, and she's doing some really great stuff with digital technology that's having kind of a preservative effect of the language and its culture. Is that fair to say? That's fair to say. So please, everybody, welcome Meg Noodin.
So I told him to stay for a second because we have a tradition of always going places and giving gifts. So I want to say Miigwech, which is conjugated, so it's thanks from all of us for having this big conference here, and Miigwech for inviting me, and I'm going to give you a copy of the book. Since you are a poet as well.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's an old tradition for us. You go somewhere, you give gifts, and so now you have to visit Milwaukee at some point.
And bring a gift.
Exactly. We're friends forever.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
So I will try and do this in a way that we have time for questions because it has been really a pleasure for me to be here. I was explaining to Daniel that this conference is not one that I regularly manage to fit into my year because I'm usually going to sort of family language camps or linguistics conferences or literary conferences, which is full enough, but this has been a really great place to be. We usually would introduce ourselves in that way in whatever place we're in and say, you kind of acknowledge the people that would have been on this land before, which in this place would have been the Ho-Chunk people. So I will go through this and hopefully we have some questions at the end. And now I'm watching. Nobody can leave because I even at the end want to try and teach you a little song, all right? So you can go home and you say, I now have a lot of ways to look at native language, native culture, and maybe teach it, and I even used it a little bit. So the title of the talk is Weweni, Take Care. The other thing that I realized is that I typically give these talks with just the Anishinaabe language on the screen, but I've tried to put English in most of the translation places there. But Anoki Makak Gaejbige Mawenjirieng would be the way we might say computers and writing conference, but everything for us is verbs, so it's sort of as we write on boxes and get together and talk would be how we translate that, which is perfect, right? It's sometimes small boxes, sometimes big boxes. And that nokimakak is a pretty standard word for us now for computer. Kachik nomage gamegong miskoasin, Stout, that's our way of saying the university. Kinomage gamek is a building where you learn knowledge, and Kichik kinomage gamek is a very big one. So that's sort of our differentiation between high school and when you move on to college. And Miskoasin is actually the original word for Wisconsin. Early on, due to French Jesuit orthography, when they came here, this is what they were told by the people who were here was the name of this place, a place where there is red, either stone or metal. So you could think about the copper and the things that are in the land here and see what they might have been trying to say. Over the years, through orthography and cultural differences and politics, it became Wisconsin, but that's what it means for us. So just to give you some context first, Anishinaabe Aki, that's how I often explain it to folks. So you take the Great Lakes, which if you were an alien sailing overhead and you look down to Earth, this would be something you could see from that far away. So this is what we would say as the woodland folks who live around here. This is kind of the center of our universe. If you go and talk to the Dene, they're going to show you canyons, and that's the center of their universe. They have four corners around those canyons. Most places in the world that have indigenous cultures that are still present in those places, they connect to the place. I think we saw some of those little islands that are over, was it Norway, Cheryl, I think, right? So people have their connections to places, and for us, this is it. We actually call all of these lakes Chigaming. They later got separate noun names, but we just call the whole thing the Great Sea. And people have been here for using this language for anywhere from 1,000 to 4,000 years. Obviously, it wasn't documented in the same way 4,000 years ago. So we don't have a very definite way of knowing, but some connections with mounds and other areas that have been excavated do show that there's cultural provenance and connectivity at least that far back. The other things that I would say to situate the language would be that we have over 200 communities. So when you look at the Great Lakes here, imagine 200 little dots around those lakes that actually have heritage communities, whether they're First Nations in Canada, whether they are recognized or unrecognized communities. Maybe they've lost the entire land base, but they all still live there and know that they're there. That's how many little communities actually use this language. And Anishinaabe is the kind of umbrella language for Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. Ojibwe also gets called Chippewa. So that's something that people, often ask, well, is it Chippewa or Ojibwe, Anishinaabe? They're all fairly synonymous unless you're trying to really fine-tune what you're saying there. And it really was the primary language of trade around this area. We have to take a little responsibility for these things that happen. So for many years, the Ho-Chunk people were called the Winnebago, and that's because they lived near a certain lake it had a muddier bottom, and so the water to us, it was a darker water, and so we called them the people of the dark water place, Winnebago, and then that name stuck, unfortunately. So they had to sort of decolonize from intertribal colonization. The same thing with Menominee. As we're sitting here in Menominee, this actually was territory of the Santee and the Ho-Chunk, and because there were people who did ricing nearby, which is Menomin. If you're out ricing, that's Menominee. So again, because our people were fairly present and very vocal, this place got called Menominee. But their name is a different one, Mekamekatau. So even way up there, the Menominee Nation, they're stuck with that name as well. They seem not to mind it as much. That's another Algonquin language. So the thing that I really wanted to try and share, which it has, like I said, it's been fun to really find the connections here. For us, all the words in the language are mostly verbs. So 80% of what we're saying is action, which is a different way to think. I think that's one of the biggest benefits when I have students and I say, why would you learn this language? Sometimes they'll say it's a political statement, or there'll be non-native students who say they want to understand the language of this place. But I think the best thing, it's the difference between, say, writing and math, or physics and biology. Each of these ways of knowing give us different systems, and ours is one very much based in action. We have a lot of stories that are typically centered on science. So early American ethnography, and I'll talk a little bit more about an example of that later, really gave some of the mythology, the stories they simplified a lot. And when you actually spend time with an elder, what you find is that everything centers back to energy. Almost every story starts with energy. And the more you go to ceremonies, the more you listen to elders speak, the more you learn. I feel it's on a spectrum to where I suppose you'd probably come out a quantum physicist or an engineer or something if you really sat with them for a long time, because different cultures have different ways of looking at the world, and ours is heavily based on how do we understand energy and energy transfer, which also then relates to why we're so interested in networks. So we have ways of connecting people to things that are animate, to things that are inanimate. The ways that we even conjugate verbs, the best way for me to teach those to students are for them to think about when an action happens, can there be a response or not? And so if we center our pedagogy as we teach on the way that we think, it's much more effective for us. So just to give some examples of that, our word for language, Inendam, Inaway, and Ijigiwe, all of those mean language, speech, and writing speech. And they all have to do with having consciousness of the way you sound. Speech itself is Gijiwe. And writing, Ishibige, is to make a line, but it's not a line that if you say that to most students, they'll think something flat and moving in one direction. It's a line that connects. So it could go backwards, it could go any directions. It's a little bit more like a fractal. And translation itself, the word for translation is anikanotan, which is to connect lines. And it's also our word for things like the relationship between grandparents and grandchildren, ankanobige. So we're often trying to show the way we connect ideas, generations. The little image that I put on the corner there is from the Sanilac petroglyphs in Michigan. And a lot of people look at this, and if you look at some of the early records, they will say, oh, look, it's a human with a bow and arrow. But if you've heard elders tell star stories at a certain time of the year, the story they always tell is that this is the teacher. So this is an image I thought you guys would all be interested in, right? This is the teacher, and the teacher, our third person doesn't have a gender. So when you just say this is the teacher, it's just teacher. And what that signifies is sending knowledge forward. So always, always, when we hear the story of this constellation or we would see this image, what we're reminded is that this is what teaching is. You're sending knowledge forward, possibly into many, many years from now. So that gives you a little bit of sense, a little bit about the language, because this is not a conference where I do the whole thing in Anishinaabe one. We have a few conferences like that. It does still happen, but it is an endangered language. And as such, one of the things I've spent a lot of time doing is trying to make sure that it's understood as a modern language, right? I mean, the worst thing for us would be if it's thought of as in the past, if it's thought of as something that was used. And there was a period in the early 1900s when one could argue that the government policies were to eradicate, to assimilate, to move totally to English, and allow these languages to fall entirely out of use. So when we revitalize them, it's one thing to preserve the grammar, the definitions, the parts of the language, but we also have to preserve the stories and the creative image of moving forward. So we have two types of stories, Debajimoanan and Adazokanak. And Debajimoanan are vernacular, everyday, it's news, it's things that are in a memorable past that you can remember. The Adazokanak are in a completely separate time. They are usually stories that have no specific starting point. They could be in the far future or the distant past, and they always are the stories that preserve the lessons that are most significant to us. One of them, the Debajimoanan, is inanimate. So when I talk about telling those stories, I talk about it in a way that it's inanimate. Those stories don't necessarily elicit the same response. The Adazokanak are talked about as if they're animate. So when we talk about knowing the Adazokanak, that sense of knowing might be the way I would know all of you. You each are a story, I might know all of you, and you think of that story as having some back and forth, having a different relationship, and having a mutability that is also not totally controllable. So it's an important thing. When you're thinking about literature, we have some stories that are, in their animacy, afforded a different type of meaning and a different way people might respond to them. And so then it's interesting to think about how do they connect with other literary traditions, other critical theories. I mean, that's pretty much what I did a lot of my initial work in the field on, was how do I now make a space for this language and these stories in literary theory. In the late 1990s, I worked for the University of Minnesota Press, and they were publishing, Deleuze and great thinkers, Derrida, people who had a lot to say about literary theory. And I would constantly think, we have got to be in that conversation. We don't just want to be the subject of ethnography or archaeology or anthropology. We want to be in that conversation. And we need to sustainably continue using our language. So that's what I wanted to try and share with you a little bit. So the next few slides will show you how some of the work in that area, starting with translation, led to composition and hopefully will leave you believing, really, it's a modern language. So this was the first book that I wrote, which is looking at some of the ways we can define Anishinaabe aesthetics. So if I read all Anishinaabe authors, can I, for one, identify what are the Anishinaabe aesthetics? If I'm reading it all in Anishinaabe, obviously that's easier. There are a number of authors, Louise Erdrich, Basil Johnston, Jim Northrup. There are a lot of authors who are Ojibwe, but they've only ever been writing in English. And there's pros and cons of that. Obviously, their books have possibly reached more readers. On the other hand, can we find in their very subject-noun-based use of English Anishinaabe aesthetics? It's an interesting proposition to try to do that. So that was what that book was about, and I thought I would just share with you so you can at least hear some of the language. What happens when, for the other thing that I did was I got an MFA and always wrote in English. I don't know why. I guess it was youth and trying to do what I was told to do. And then later said, no, I think I'm just going to write all in Ojibwe. So what happens when you do that? How can you think differently and connect to other traditions? So here's this poem. Majbige is to begin writing, because this is one of the earlier ones that I wrote in the language, and then I'll share it with you in English. Wasnode. Nanan awesia gi mamwe ba ba madaziwok. Megwa nokamis nibagizis gigijagong inokadong. Mizizakong ski gawajise. Gijagong ojawashgong debishko and de ojagingong. Wabus giningabizo. Gijagong baswewe onittawegeng. Nui nim gaskanozut gnebek. Debishko zinaba ajweying jingwaking. Giwaden jaganashishin. Gigaskanazut omaki. Megwa ginendamo nimosh. Nimindoak. Gijagong giroseak. So it's a poem called The Northern Lights. So our word for Northern Lights is wasnode, which combines a sense of electricity and sound. And it was a story that I was trying to do with kids to get them to learn different animals, different words, but not just by memorizing a list of animals, actually having them maybe role play or say something. So these 5 animals traveled together while Grandmother Moon sliced the sky. Deer fly zummed, the sky is as green as my eyes. Rabbit trembled, the sky echoes in my ears. I will dance, whispered the snake, like a ribbon behind the pines. I want this wind to consume me, whispered the frog. Meanwhile, the dog thought, I smell the sky hunters. So if you start with that and you get kids to think about the words that are in there, almost every one of those lines could be a completely different story. For instance, we have, if you look hard, I tried to find a picture of the Northern Lights. Can you see the Big Dipper? Right? Now, if you look at that picture and you see the Big Dipper off to one side there, right? That's Ojikanong, that's the Fisher Star, which gets called the Big Dipper now as a constellation. But we have stories there where that fisher was a little animal and jumped up. And so talking about how these animal stories became constellations here. And if you see the Big Dipper and you look across, you can just kind of barely see what would be thought of as the Belt of Orion, which is Nanaboshanong. So we could spend hours, I won't now, but talking about which constellation, which star, which story, and some of these things, you can really dig into the words. So even just saying Grandmother Moon, Nokomis Dbekat Gizis, is like saying Grandmother Night Sun. So you can think about how is it that the moon reflects the light of the sun, what's that relationship, what are those connections. You can talk about our word for west, which is Ningabianong, which is where the Nanabujuanong star has the form of a rabbit, a trembling tail. So you have all the semiotics that were embedded in the language and in the stories originally to play with if you're not trying to conform just to an English way of writing. So I was having fun with that, right? And then I decided, okay, I'll try some other things with friends. Now we'll see if I can do this. Because then this is, obviously, being a person that loves technology. Actually, I think our whole tribe probably loves technology. So I'll see if I can play this for you. Now I don't have the sound. Why would that be? Or maybe it'll come. There it is.
We used them long ago, clothespins. We can taste them still, clenched in our teeth. We pinched wooden clothespins on clouds, lines of a little child's clothes, lines of a man's clothes, heavy denim, and a woman's clothes, fine white fabrics of nightgowns, underthings, blouses in clouds, sun seen through clouds. We plucked the clothespins, collapsed the clouds of clothing. Wind combed the water, came crying. We collected the clothes, the clouds. We used them long ago, clothespins. We could taste them still, clenched in our teeth.
So I'll let it stop there, see if I can get back out of it. So this is a poem originally by an Ojibwe poet, Hyde Erdrich, who lives in the Twin Cities area. And with these things, we were trying to really disrupt. What's the idea of native poetry? What's the idea of long ago? I mean, for us, actually, long ago might be when clothespins. Our kids did not know what a clothespin was, right? So what is the long ago? What is a subject that Ojibwe writers would write about? Actually writing about the way their mothers and grandmothers worked is something we would consider contemporary and yet still traditional. So that was something that we were trying to do, and by putting it in this video format, it allowed us to, just reach more people because it's a very specific audience that might be interested in such a thing, but it also allowed us to have teachers feel more confident in teaching about Native literature or Native poetry. They didn't have to know how to read Ojibwe the way they could read Emily Dickinson. They could say, all right, here's some poetry from another culture, and we can listen to it here. So that was one thing we were trying to do. And the other thing, I should switch back again, sorry, that this connected to is the fact that the image that we pulled apart there, the image of the clouds and the clothespins, this came out of a collaboration with Broadsided Press, which is an interesting organization. If you don't know it, maybe some of you do. They have people print out poetry and then vectorize it by putting it somewhere in the world and then connecting online where they've put it. So it was a really nice way for us to actually move poetry back and forth between the world of a video format to a broadside format, having people be able to hear it in multiple languages. So you'll see that a theme of the conversation here is how we really can leverage technology to achieve what we're trying to do much more efficiently. And then Hyde did another thing in her book of poetry called Cell Traffic. And she's a very playful person, and she said, well, I'm going to write some prose poems, and then you just do anything, which is the good kind of collaboration, right? Where you have that kind of freedom. So it was really almost more a call and response format. And I'll just show you a couple of examples, because when that's what we can do, you can hear the play of the language better. So she wrote, we walk and talk of work, laugh about the kids, then get to the business of money. So I was able to play with it a little bit, and you can see where I'm choosing things for sound, you know. Nda bochidime, nda bapime, nda de badaminan, noki winan, minwa jonia, minwa de bajmangidwa, ni Johnsononic. Money this and money that, which in my translation, because we have reduplication in our words, becomes jonia. Jonia. I can do different things with the word that I couldn't do in English in the same way. So there was another one that was, it's always one of my favorites to share when we talk about this happening. So the way we talk in front of the kids as if nothing and everything were sacred all at once. Gagi Gadoyang, Pini Janisak, Beshoak, Kagego Chipitendasin, Minua Kinagego Chipitendan. So I can play with sort of the Chipitendan, can, echo there. We've made a mess, and maybe fundamentalists yet, or pray for cults, as Grandma said, of unbaptized babies. Gonama nda gindazame minua gawin debwata siangidwa. Ekidot gokamis makade koniak. We know jawat gawin mashe zigwandasian benujiak. She always had arcane church law down pat. Baptism of desire. Pane gwa nitan sosna. Chitwa naknegewanan. Zigandoe zongi zagiruin. Which is literally the baptism of the strongest love. But it's so much more fun to hear those Z's that we have in our language and repeat that and play with that a little bit. So that's what you can do when you have that freedom. I would be remiss, especially this year, if I did not mention Kim Blazer, who is another Ojibwe poet and is actually currently the Poet Laureate of Wisconsin. She's a different kind of collaborator who said, well, here is the poem I wrote when my friend passed away. Will you translate it? That's a different thing, right? I mean, you want to get the precision of exactly what she wants in there. And that is what she wanted. She wanted as literal a translation as possible. So you don't see in the Anishinaabe one as much play with the sound as I might have. But the interesting thing about this is just a little excerpt of the poem. But what was interesting is she says in English, because the smallness of our being is our only greatness. And if death, too, is a change of being, perhaps action counts. And if death is a land of unknowing, perhaps we do well to live with uncertainty. And if death is a forested land, it would be good to learn trees. And if death is a kingdom, it would be good to practice service. And if the soul leaves our body, then we must rehearse goodbye. Now, you can see how somewhat noun-focused it is. So I don't really have a way to say death as a noun. I can say conjugated niboying, which is saying something different. So the phrase that I ended up having to use is migishpin pi niboying. So if, then, when we die. So it puts you into the sentence and into the poem a little bit differently, but it's close. The other thing is we don't have a word for goodbye. So that was a little problem as well. So, what the last lines there are mi gishpin ojichak, weoing, nugadong, gonema abdek nemo bimosad which actually is similar if the soul leaves the body, but then what we might have to do is rehearse or practice that dying that we've talked about in here. So it's always an interesting thing when we find those spaces between one language and the other. And I think these are the things we need to do to keep the language contemporary. So that gets to the point of writing an entire book where I had all the poems originally written in Anishinaabe. So all the poems in Weweni, eventually I just got old and said, I don't care, I'm just going to write in Anishinaabe anyway. And I was told by, believe me, a number of people that you're never really going to find a market for that. But if you wait long enough, this is the lesson there. If you wait long enough, I guess, and actually teach enough people at summer camps and first-year students, eventually you will have readers, right? So my inspiration, I would take, these are two quotes that I've always found really inspiring. We rediscover poetry as a powerful universe of words where relations, configurations, forces are affirmed through sound, figure, rhythmic mobility in a unified and sovereignly autonomous space. Thus, the poet produces a work of pure language, and language in this work is a return to its essence. And I remember reading that long ago thinking, yeah, okay, that guy thinks about poetry just the way we do. And Simon Ortiz, who is an indigenous poet himself, also says poetry is life, struggle, resistance, continuance, life, 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 always. And so I think that there are ways to have more of a dialogue between indigenous literary traditions and I guess we often say Western, but that always seems strange. But you know what I mean by that, the Western literary critics. And so when I wrote this book, it was a collection of all these poems that were published first in Anishinaabe. So they privileged that sound. They privileged those patterns. They privileged those subjects. And for a long time, I thought, oh, I'm not even going to translate them, But I did, of course, because I have students, and I have parents, and I have kids, and they're like, oh, what did you really say there? So I would go through and I would write it, but they were not the prettiest translations. And eventually I realized, well, okay, you do know how to speak English. So I came up with versions that were fairly clean and reasonable in English. So the book actually has first the Anishinaabe one, and then the English, which to me is quite the leap. If you know the language, you realize, and hopefully I've shared with you guys even just in the last 15 minutes, enough for you to see that slippage, that what's kind of not said when you do a real nice English version and a real nice Anishinaabe version, there's a bit that you're missing in terms of what the literal might mean, but people can always look that up, and people can always just take Ojibwe language classes. And so what was very interesting was to figure out how this would appear. So the publisher, who is a wonderful publisher, Wayne State University Press. I teach in Milwaukee, but I also live in Ann Arbor, so I go home almost every week. A very academic kind of lifestyle, right? And so Wayne State University Press published the book and did a beautiful job with it. But what you'll see is they said, well, let's be innovative. Let's do multimedia. Let's have something where you read the poems and we'll have them online. People can hear them, people can download them. So this is great. So I read the poems, I sent them to them, and oh, well, our marketing department said they need to be in English first, which I thought, oh no, but okay, it's your press, you do what you like. Which then led us on the page that I've run for, wow, almost 16 years now, Ojibwe.net, to say, and here's how we would put it, So it's really finding that space between, obviously there's a huge advantage if I have this book of bilingual poetry published by Wayne State University Press. That will reach more other poets, more other readers than I ever would by just posting a poem on here. But what I was able to do here, instead of having just the English show up, we'll see now if this works too. Because if I go and do a poetry reading, this is typically how this poem will come out. Let's see if it works. Wabawawanon, so swanning, namamashtonshi, owning Guiganan in ocean sub, Nimiwad, Wabmagwad, Nanagodnon, Shikeawad, Nanagodnon, Nijuat, Gibakowamji, Gazawat, Sakanandamawat, Nokajumingwenewat, Minwa, Mashkawiten. So that's how I would usually read it, because I come from a tradition of being sort of dragged to events where the elders would often sing. They would sing things. They would present things in a way that was profoundly more memorable than had they read. When I was working on an MFA, we would do an MFA reading, and we would all sound like this. You laugh because you know that it's true, right? Right? So I had to get away from that in this, because so often, if I were going to go read this in an Anishinaabe community, they would expect this. Obviously, if I go read it in Iowa at the Creative Writing House, it's a different thing. You need to be able to move from one to the other. So we had to think about how we present things. And there's a lot that could be said. It has been very accidental for us, but I wouldn't underestimate the number of times we've gone to elders and said, so how would we put this on the web for the entire world to see? How would you order these pieces of information? You can see that on the Wayne State Press, if you think of that old kind of, the WordPress, bar across the top options, it's books, journals, news and events, I spelled about wrong, and support. On ours, you have lessons, stories, songs, projects, resources, and then something about us. And the lessons, stories, songs, and projects are very intentional. You need to take a little bit of time to just learn a little bit about the language if you're going to dig into this site. Then stories are the way that you further your understanding, and songs might be the way that you would celebrate and sing about what you maybe have learned or know. And then the projects are what more and more I think our campuses are encouraging and giving us credit for, is that sort of community space where you're reaching out and you're connecting communities. You're doing work in a community. And so for us, so much of our language work, if we just sat on a campus and said, well, we're going to make lessons and archive it all, it would be nowhere near as meaningful as if we took it out into the community and did something with it. So let's see. Actually, I got to go this way. And so this is just in some way to explain how, on one hand, I feel like a little bit of a visitor to this country of your conference. On the other hand, it did force me to tweet after not having tweeted in a while. And I immediately had people kind of respond and ask questions, and that was good. We've had, as I mentioned, Ojibwe.net for a very long time, and our main way of using that is the website is a static platform to post lessons. It's not an interactive, unless there are some places where we have quizzes and opportunities for people to sort of review what they've known. But it's not a place that people log on and blog or give comments. Our Facebook page is that space. And you would be surprised how many people go on Facebook. Our site is one that has right now almost about 4,000 people that look at it fairly regularly. Much to my daughter's total embarrassment, I posted her high school graduation picture. Actually, I think I do have that here. Of course, right? You knew it would come to this, right? So here you have, yes. So you can see our space. And like I said, much to her dismay, here's not only your mother posting your high school graduation picture, but I did a whole song. So I translated that lovely Leanne Womack, I Hope You Dance, and put it on there, and only 3,462 people have clicked on it, which, again, to her, she's very used to this by now, as you can imagine. But when we did a posting around the Super Bowl, what to yell as you're watching the Super Bowl game, we had 10,000 people visit that posting or share it and interact with it. And we are pretty serious about our analysis of the use of these pages. So we do regular analytics to know what things people are using most frequently, what to add, what to post, when to post, what tools they need to better understand the language that's posted there. And then our flats, our lessons page, the Ojibwe.net, we're really very particular about that as well, because we can see so much from the use that what today's Anishinaabe people or people who are allies of Anishinaabe that want to learn the language, they need a very small bite of information, a way to review it repeatedly, to come back to it, a way to save it, a way to download it. And we've tried to set things up so that people get the information in meaningful layers. Initially in revitalization, there was a lot of work that simply kind of translated a first-year Spanish or first-year French textbook, and that was really inappropriate. It just didn't work as well at all. People would not go back to things. They did not find things. I think what we did now is our lessons, they're very short, but they have a lot of the cultural content. So even if all I'm doing is teaching you to say, Mino Gijep, it will talk a little bit about where that good day, in the word for day, you have a reference to the science of rotation. So you have a sense that these people always knew they were rotating and that they were rotating around a source of light. And so it's very interesting how if you're teaching people words, to teach them that the meaning held in those words tells you a lot about the culture. I don't think our people ever thought the world was flat. It's good to know, you know, and I think for a lot of young Native students, it's empowering to know that your cultural continuity is something that is worth having, not in a sort of exotic way, but in a very meaningful way. So the other things here that I wanted to make sure that we just talked a little bit about, the way that what we do now shows technology, even though it feels so new, is actually a space between our older traditions of orality and our semi-textual traditions. So we were always, I believe, messing with image and sound, performance, finding ways to encode information in dynamic and multimodal ways, which we might all talk about now, but I think for us, we try to recognize that that's actually a very ancient way of thinking about things. We would gather folks together and think of presentations as performances. They'd better be engaging, or everyone will, be engaged in a different way. And so this is just one example of one of the poems in Weweni where you can look at each of those poems and think about what are they trying to teach? What more might this poem have been used for? I had to do a summer biology camp for some Native kids, and again, they say, oh, come and teach them some words, like colors or things for water and dirt. But I said, well, what about algae? This is really important in our culture. It's algae. It's a little source of energy. So we had, a long conversation about why that was actually a very traditionally Anishinaabe topic. So you see the reality of algae. This is actually Green Bay, looking very green, right? And our word for green is ojawashkazo. It's also the same word for blue. So when you think about that, you think, well, now there were some people that knew blue becomes green, and back and forth very often. So the poem Nambik Jibwa Minokaming Mishbiju Ondoe Apigizis Zagi Asage Giskang Ojawashkande Babin Zikawagan Biskang Ojawashkande Nitanimit Nitar Kabizot Ashamat Ashamat Gijagak Dibikak Zagiase Mijmike Migosjagagiat Akinan Bashka Bigwanat, which is blue-green becoming. Under the shore before spring, the water panther changes colors, taking off his blue coat, putting on his green coat, dancing brilliantly covered in algae, feeding the days and nights, making food of sunshine, teasing the earth to bloom. And then we would have a conversation about algae, right? Because we're all going to need to have a lot of conversations about algae in the Great Lakes if we keep putting what we have been in the water. So to move these things into arenas that we're having conversations that mean a lot to us. So people have often documented, the native love of nature, but this is what that embodies itself as. So this is one that I did with my friend Guy Meadows, who's now at Michigan Tech. So there's some Michigan Tech people here, I think. This one is Numbing, see, I knew there were, Wabanong Chijajiga. And this is one where he had done research under Lake Huron. And I would have to say it's in the top 10 moments of teaching for me when he actually came to our Ojibwe class, which had mostly Native students, but not all Native students. It definitely had people who had been spending 2 years learning this language. And I'm not sure that they connected learning this language to the place in a really tangible, visceral way. And when he came and he said, well, we've done research, and under Lake Huron, you'll see things that reveal probably the people who spoke the language you're speaking were here maybe as long ago as 6,000 years. And you could just see people who had been told, well, no, there was nothing here, everybody came over on the Bering Strait, just suddenly revising in their minds their identity, their sense of place, their understanding of continuity across generations. I mean, I remember being sent to school with Vine Deloria Jr.'s article, Low Bridge, Everybody Cross, which was a very sophisticated rebuttal of the Bering Strait theory. But I was sort of the only kid that had that perspective in my class. Most of the other students and the teachers at the time, they just said, no, Native people, like, they arrived here too. Nobody was really in this place long, long ago. So to have instances where you can talk about the science of understanding these, the ways to connect culture across time, it's important, to not lose that. So I thought I had to think of, how would I say interventions at this conference, right? So we have I broke it up there, that would be one word, niwanishkewem ananik. So the wanishkwem is to interrupt someone, but again, it's one of those verbs that the only way you can use it is to imply that the person you're interrupting might react, right? So Newanish-Gwem, Anonik could be that we interrupt them. So you can see here's Henry Schoolcraft and Jane Schoolcraft. Henry Schoolcraft, most people knew who he was, early territorial governor. I won't go into all the history. Famous author of many early ethnographic documents, notably The Indian in His Wigwam, Characteristics of the Red Race. That book that's the picture there was published in 1848. But then his wife, Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, and her mother, despite the fact that he was obviously living with them up in Sault Ste. Marie, clearly he did learn a lot more about the culture than other people, but his way of representing what he called the red man of the Americas was so different than what the stories might really have held. And so now to go back and intervene in that understanding is also what we try to do. So this is one where she wrote a poem which in English, if you look up the documents for the time in 1839 when it was published, it was all written in English, lovely rhyming iambic pentameter, and it was on leaving my children John and Jane at school in the Atlantic States, which basically meant that she didn't want them to go to the boarding schools. And so because they could pass as biracial kids, she sent them out east to get an education. But she knew when she was doing that of course they wouldn't be using their language anymore. They wouldn't be living in that place that she knew of as home. So Robert Dale Parker wrote a book about this and encountered us, those of us that teach, and he said, well, hey, so what do you think? There's a couple of places where you can see there's this E at the end. What does that mean linguistically? And I said, well, you know what that means? It means that it was a song, right? So we tried to explain that's what we thought this probably was. So now, I have no idea to know if this was how she would sing it, but now this is the way we sing it. Let's see if I get it right. Neandam mekauyanin hednokia waswakamik hednokia ndanasens Nguizans ishenaganagwa waswakamik ednokia, because we knew that we used these vowels at the end of lines for that reason. So it was a way to kind of insert a different understanding. And that is really what we do. As I kind of wrap up here, we try to do a lot of that. So this is Wase and Neali, and one is Oneida, one is Anishinaabe. And the little elementary school near me in Milwaukee, they teach Menominee, Oneida, and Ojibwe. And much to my dismay as a teacher, I went out there one day to kind of have drum group with them and play and hang out a little bit. And I told the girls, I said, well, let's go sing outside. We can do some Oneida and Ojibwe. And they said, oh, can we do it outside of the classroom? And I thought, oh my gosh, what has it come to? That initially these classrooms were this sort of dangerous site of erasure for us, where when people went to boarding school, that's where the language was lost. Now we've got kids where that's the only place that's safe to use it. That seemed so strange. And so I'm like, no, girls, of course, come out here and sing. You have to right now, And so I said, well, let's see. What do you want to sing about? And we're going to sing outside. And we're going to sing in both languages. Well, once they got thinking about it, what they decided is that they didn't like a song they had recently heard some siblings who went to public school in Milwaukee singing. It was Rain, Rain, Go Away. You know the rest, right? Which they said, no, aren't we supposed to celebrate the rain? Well, yes. So somehow down through time, that bit of knowledge that we need to recognize and celebrate the rain and celebrate spring and accept the seasonal changes, that had gotten to them. So that was good. So they came up with this song, which on one side, of course, challenged even me because I'm not a good Oneida speaker to learn Oneida. And they sang it and taught each other's languages. And at that school now, we try increasingly new tactics and interventions at all times to just see if we can't get these kids to feel confident and proud speaking their languages, but also to kind of recreate that cosmopolitan space that must have at one time been Wisconsin, where you have three very different language families. You have the Algonquin languages, the Anishinaabe, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Menominee. Then you have the Ho-Chunk, which is a Siouan. We say Siouan now, but it would be a Lakota, Dakota, Ho-Chunk, Santee, Hidatsa. Totally different language family. There are no cognates. I don't understand a thing they say when they speak. I can understand across, Menominee and Ojibwe. And then you have the Oneida, who, due to shifts in politics, they were removed from the New York area to our area and have lived for a very long time now in the eastern part of Wisconsin. So you have this really amazing collision of languages that if we could celebrate those and view them all as modern languages, I think it would just enrich the way all of us think about the place that we're all sharing. So here's the last thing, which we'll see if we can teach you guys a song, right? So this came from an example of what happens when you have a website. People email you from Germany and they say, oh, we're doing a display. It's called The Jungle of Language. And we want to talk about endangered languages. And we want to have a coffin to show that languages are dying. Right. Yeah, I know. You're scared too, right? And so can you give us the words for sun, water, and children? And I thought, wow, not only do I not want sun, water, or children to be thought of in the context of death, there was just so much about it that we thought, okay, well, as educators, let's intervene, So we talked to them about, how about maybe we give you a song that communicates how we still use these words today, and you would then be able to maybe put an image of the sun and how it cleans the water, and these children might swim in that water, because it really was a very simple misunderstanding. It was a well-intentioned linguist who understood and wanted to have a very powerful display of languages dying. On the other hand, I just didn't want people walking away with that as their primary image of our language, right? So this was the little song that we wrote, which is very simple. So you guys should all learn to sing it, right? So here's how it goes. We did it so that they could sing it in a round, because she also explained to me that this is a very interactive museum. So we've seen how museums have changed, and I think that has a lot to do with exactly what everyone here has been talking about, how we use different ways of learning. You go to a museum now and you're seeing things you can interact with. Lights go on, videos start playing, all kinds of ways to communicate differently. So she said if we gave her this song, she would set it up where they would push a little button, they could hear it, and hear it sort of echo as a round, and also make it available for teachers to teach it to kids and sing that way, which is fun. So I'm sure you guys can do it, right? So we'll just say the words, right? Gijasiget Jesus. So just try it now. Gijasiget Jesus. Bean nugamijige. Bean nugamijige. We da bigazowat. We da bigazowat. Benujiuk. Right. So here's how it goes. I'll sing it once, and then you guys can join in. We don't have to try the round thing, but you should really try it. This is Wisconsin. You should use the language, right? Gijasiget Jesus, Benugamijige, we da bigazowat benujiuk. Gijasiget Jesus, Benugamijige, we da bigazowat benujiuk. You kind of got it. Try it one more time, right? Gijasiget Jesus, Benugamijige, we da bigazowat benujiuk. So that was awesome. You should give yourselves a round of applause. So I will end there and take questions if you have them, but hopefully what I've left you with is the impression that all of these same tools and methodologies, practices, paradigms that you're using, I think we are using actually in language revitalization and in the attempt to keep our language a modern language. So you can find this on the web too, so when you go back, teach somebody else to sing it, right? So I don't know if people have questions or... It's a big space, yes.
Just a comment. We've had a lot of speakers who've come to computers and writing to talk to us about topics, often about technology, but I think you've come the closest of anybody to connecting with the spirit of this.
Wow, gumigwetch waninam. It has been really fun to be here. I mean, in little workshop or conversation, all of those spaces that I felt myself in, I felt like, these are our people. They're just maybe a different clan, but they're my people too. You know? So yeah, it's been really nice. So I don't know, there might not be. Oh yeah, okay.
So I'm afraid that I've fallen into this coffin mistake.
Yeah.
Trying to introduce non-English literature, culture in a way that's interesting by emphasizing its strangeness, its differentness. And so I wonder if you could get some suggestions on how you would recommend introducing poetry like you talk about into maybe an English poetry classroom.
Right, yeah, well, I think it's two things. I mean, one is, it's okay, it is strange. I mean, it is very different because it moves out of the Romance languages entirely. I mean, there's no cognates anymore. There's nothing about the language that will give any cues to meaning as you compare it. So it's not quite like when you have a student read something in Spanish or French and they might be able to piece out similarities of grammar and meaning. But I think that to really just find it out there and let them hear it a bit. I think the other thing is I tell every single teacher that I know, every single one of us in the U.S. has got at least one nation nearby. There's over 500 federally recognized tribes in the United States. And so it doesn't matter what state you're in, there's something that's out there. I recently went to Denver with a student that was defending his dissertation in Anishinaabe theology. So I got called in as the outside person on the committee, right? And I really had to kind of rethink the Sand Creek Massacre and the Arapaho and what are those stories? Because to me, those are foreign stories as well. So, you know, I think for all of us to look around us and find the most relevant traditions right nearby. We only have about, they say 200 of the languages that might have once been here are still spoken. Sadly, even the best linguists who give estimates will say that typically they only imagine 3 will survive beyond 30 years, which is terrifying, but you never know. It is true for our language that I'd say 80% of the speakers are over 75, and I probably only know maybe 10 people under 20 that are proficient. So, I mean, you can definitely envision some, I wouldn't want to say coffin yet, right? But you definitely, it's fair to emphasize that context. There is an endangerment. I mean, it's like when we hear about the bees right now in the news. I mean, same thing. This is happening all over our globe. We understand endangerment and the value of diversity. And so to talk about it in those ways, I think it does make some sense. Yeah.
Well, I want to mention to Cindy that as a speaker, you've come very close to addressing what we do and what we're thinking as personally someone who's spent the last 15 years on a translation.
Oh, yeah.
From Japanese. Dealing with it, it's something that my wife wrote. She is Japanese. And the worldview, shifting the worldview, ways of looking at the world in other ways that enrich our lives. This has, I think, for me, it has a lot to do with the way we think about mediating and remediating in different modes and medias, from text to visual to audio. Those spaces, the ways in which you can think in different ways, I think it's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, me what? Yeah, no, it's true. You know, and I should say, the other thing is when I was just writing poetry, right, and people said, you can't really do this for a living. I was a director of marketing for Borders and Barnes & Noble. Like, this is true. So I will say, in that sort of way, if anyone feels they need a book, I brought them if you would rather buy one here than look on Amazon. And then the other thing I was looking at in just terms of connections, so I mean, here we have things coming out of the Digital Rhetoric Collaborative that say on them, you know, Digital Samaritans, a forthcoming title, explores rhetorical delivery and cultural sovereignty. I mean, this is why I think you guys really are my people. You know, this is exactly what I would think about. How do we understand different sovereign viewpoints? The other thing that, see, all these little things, I have to read into them. This business about the wikis. I've had 2 conferences now this year where my technology has had to expand. So I went to a conference on literature, native literature, and Siobhan Senior was there. She's recently edited a really good anthology of Eastern woodland writers. And she was there talking about how little native representation there is on Wikipedia. And this was a workshop. And 4 hours later, I had completed my first Wikipedia entry, right? So the other thing I realized, though, is, man, honestly, if you can get a student to do a Wikipedia entry that sticks, that is so much more powerful than getting them to write a paper, I think. Because it really was interesting to learn, A, about the need for diversity in that environment. So the fact that you guys have the focus on diverse ways of thinking and knowing about writing and composition and computers is really just great to know. And it was also very powerful to see how much that space is reviewed constantly and how you need to be in those spaces to make a difference. I can't just say to my native friends, like, let's sit off in a corner and do our language. We need to be out there. We need to connect if we really want to continue existing. So it has been a treat to visit here, totally. We're ending right on time, Daniel, maybe? Pull all these out.